The crack of a bullwhip split the air like lightning, followed by Beatrice Anderson's scream. Blood trickled from her lip as she scrambled backward across the dusty floor of their remote cabin, her skirts tangling around her legs as she tried to escape her husband's rage. "Where's my dinner, woman?" Frank Anderson bellowed, his boots stomping toward her with menacing purpose. The smell of whiskey hung around him like a cloud. "Worthless, that's what you are." Beatrice's hands slipped on the rough-hewn floorboards as she tried to crawl away, her golden hair falling in disarray around her bruised face. She'd married Frank 5 years ago in 1867, believing his promises of a good life in Colorado territory. The daughter of a shopkeeper from St. Louis, she'd been enchanted by Frank's tales of adventure and prosperity in the West. Now at 23, she found herself trapped in a nightmare miles from the nearest town. "Frank, please," she begged. "The stove wouldn't light. I tried." "Excuses," he roared, towering over her. His boot connected with her ribs, sending pain shooting through her body. "Always excuses." Beatrice curled into herself, protecting her middle as another blow landed. Through tears, she could see the door hanging slightly open from Frank's violent entrance. Freedom lay just beyond, but miles of wilderness separated her from any help. She tried running once before. Frank had tracked her down and made her pay dearly for the attempt. The next morning dawned crisp and clear over the mountains. Frank had passed out after his rage, and Beatrice moved quietly through the cabin, wincing with every step. Her body was a canvas of purple bruises, both fresh and fading. She heated water and began washing dishes, her movements mechanical, her mind elsewhere. Through the window, she spotted a rider approaching. Her heart quickened with both hope and fear. Visitors were rare this far out, and Frank didn't take kindly to strangers. The man rode tall in the saddle, his broad-shouldered silhouette framed against the morning sun. He dismounted with the easy grace of someone who'd spent his life on horseback, tying his chestnut stallion to the hitching post. Beatrice watched as he removed his hat, revealing dark hair and a face weathered by sun and wind. Frank stirred from his drunken slumber at the sound of boots on the porch. "Who's that?" he growled, stumbling to his feet. A knock sounded at the door. Frank yanked it open, revealing a tall man in a worn leather duster, dust from the trail still clinging to his clothes. "Morning," the stranger said, his voice deep and steady. "Name's Caleb Sutton. My horse threw a shoe about 3 miles back. Wondered if I might trouble you for some water and perhaps a nail or two." Beatrice watched from the shadows as Frank sized up the visitor. The stranger, Caleb, stood at least 3 inches taller than her husband, with shoulders that spoke of hard work and strength. His eyes, a clear blue that reminded her of summer skies, briefly met hers before returning to Frank. "Got no nails to spare," Frank said curtly, but then seemed to reconsider. "But I suppose you can water your horse. Beatrice, fetch this man some water." Beatrice moved carefully to the water bucket, filling a ladle. As she stepped onto the porch, she kept her eyes downcast, but she could feel Caleb's gaze on her face, surely noting the fresh bruise blooming on her cheekbone. "Thank you, madam," he said softly, taking the ladle. Their fingers brushed, and she felt an unexpected flutter in her chest. "Where you headed?" Frank demanded, following them outside. "Silver Cliff," Caleb replied, turning his attention back to Frank. "Got some cattle business there." "That's a day's ride southwest," Frank said, his tone suspicious. "You're off course," Caleb shrugged. "Trail got washed out from the storms last week. Had to detour." Frank grunted, seemingly satisfied with the explanation. "Well, water your horse and be on your way." "Obliged," Caleb said, tipping his hat. His eyes found Beatrice's again, and this time she didn't look away. Something passed between them, an understanding, perhaps, or recognition. She felt her cheeks grow warm. Frank noticed the exchange. "Beatrice," he snapped. "Inside. Now." She hurried to obey, feeling Caleb's eyes on her back as she retreated into the cabin. Over the next 2 weeks, Beatrice found herself watching the trail more often, wondering if the stranger would return. Frank's temper had worsened since Caleb's visit, as if he'd sensed something in that brief interaction that threatened him. One afternoon, as Beatrice hung laundry in the yard, the sound of hoofbeats made her heart leap. Caleb Sutton appeared around the bend, riding the same chestnut stallion. This time he wasn't alone. A packhorse followed, laden with supplies. "Afternoon, Mrs. Anderson," he called, removing his hat. "Your husband around?" "He's gone hunting," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Won't be back until sundown." Caleb dismounted, approaching slowly as one might a skittish deer. "I brought something for your cabin," he said, reaching into his saddlebag. He produced a package wrapped in brown paper. "New hinges for your door. Noticed it was hanging crooked on my last visit." Beatrice stared at the offering. "Why would you do that?" Caleb's expression softened. "Sometimes a door that closes properly can make all the difference." She understood his meaning. A door that closed properly could keep things out or in, it could be locked, it could provide safety. "I couldn't accept, please," he said. "Let me install them for you." Against her better judgment, Beatrice nodded. She watched as Caleb worked, his movements efficient and practiced. He told her about his ranch a day's ride away where he raised horses. He spoke of the open country, the freedom of the plains, the beauty of the mountains. "How long have you been married?" he asked as he tested the newly hung door. Beatrice looked away. 5 years, and has he always?" Caleb gestured to the fading bruise on her face. She turned away, shame washing over her. "I should not speak of such things with a stranger." "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "It's not my place to ask." He closed the door, demonstrating how smoothly it now swung. "There, that should hold." "Thank you," she whispered. Caleb hesitated, then reached into his pocket. "I have a small place about 20 miles east of here if you ever need." He stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. Instead, he pressed a folded piece of paper into her hand. "Directions, just in case." Before she could respond, the sound of a rifle being cocked broke the silence. "Step away from my wife." Frank's voice came from the edge of the clearing, cold and dangerous. Caleb raised his hands slowly, turning to face the man with the rifle. "Mr. Anderson, just fixing your door. Thought I'd repay your hospitality." Frank advanced, his rifle aimed at Caleb's chest. "I don't recall asking for any help." His eyes narrowed as he looked between them. "How long's this been going on, Beatrice? You entertaining men while I'm away?" "No, Frank, it's not." "Shut up." Frank swung the rifle toward her, then back to Caleb. "Get on your horse and ride out. Don't stop until you're miles from here." Caleb's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "As you wish." He moved to his horse, mounting with one fluid motion. Before riding off, he looked at Beatrice one last time. "Madam," that single word held volumes: promise, concern, a question. That night, Frank's rage was unlike anything Beatrice had experienced before. His jealousy and suspicion fueled by whiskey, he accused her of infidelity, of planning to leave him. She denied everything, but it only seemed to enrage him further. "You think he wants you?" Frank sneered, grabbing her arm so tight she gasped. "A man like that, he was just looking for a quick tumble with a lonely farmer's wife." "It wasn't like that," Beatrice protested, tears streaming down her face. "He was just being kind." "Kind?" Frank laughed bitterly. "Men aren't kind to women without wanting something in return." He dragged her across the cabin, throwing her against the wall. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs. As she slid to the floor, dazed, he loomed over her. "You belong to me," he growled. "Till death do us part." "Remember those vows?" Beatrice's hand closed around the piece of paper in her pocket. Caleb's directions. In that moment, she made her decision. Later that night, after Frank had passed out, Beatrice gathered what few belongings she could carry. She took some food, a canteen of water, her mother's silver locket, and the small amount of money she'd managed to hide away over the years. With trembling hands, she saddled the old mare from the stable and led her quietly away from the cabin. The night was cold, stars brilliant in the vast Colorado sky. Using Caleb's directions and the stars to guide her, Beatrice rode east, her heart pounding with fear and desperate hope. She rode through the night, stopping only briefly to rest her horse. By dawn, she was exhausted but determined. The landscape had changed, becoming more rugged, with pine forests giving way to open meadows. When the sun was high overhead, she spotted smoke rising from a chimney in the distance. A small ranch house came into view, nestled against a backdrop of rocky hills. A corral held several horses and a barn stood nearby. This had to be Caleb's place. As she approached, the door to the house opened. Caleb stepped out, shading his eyes against the sun. Recognition dawned on his face, followed by concern. He hurried toward her. "Beatrice," he said, reaching up to help her dismount. His hands were gentle on her waist. "What happened?" She nearly collapsed against him, the exhaustion of the night's journey catching up with her. "I couldn't stay," she whispered. "Not anymore." Caleb led her inside, where an older woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair stood by the stove. "Martha, this is Mrs. Anderson," Caleb said. "She'll be staying with us for a while." Martha took one look at Beatrice's bruised face and nodded. "I'll prepare a bath and some food." Over the next few days, Beatrice recovered her strength. Caleb's ranch was modest but well kept, with a small herd of horses in the valley below. Martha, she learned, was Caleb's aunt who had helped raise him after his parents died in a cholera outbreak. On the fourth morning, as Beatrice sat on the porch watching the sun rise over the mountains, Caleb joined her. "Frank will come looking for you," he said quietly. Beatrice nodded. "I know. When he does, I'll be ready." Caleb's voice held no bravado, just quiet determination. "You're safe here." She looked at him, studying the strong lines of his profile. "Why are you helping me? You barely know me." Caleb was silent for a long moment. "My mother," he finally said. "My father was like Frank. One night when I was 10 years old, he beat her so badly she couldn't get up from the floor. I watched, too small to help her." His hands clenched on his knees. "She died 3 days later. I swore I'd never stand by and watch another woman suffer if I could help it." Beatrice's throat tightened. She reached out, placing her hand over his. "I'm sorry." He turned his hand, clasping hers gently. "You have nothing to be sorry for." In the days that followed, Beatrice found herself drawn to Caleb's quiet strength and gentle manner. He taught her to ride better, to shoot a rifle, to feel the confidence that had been beaten out of her over the years of her marriage. In the evenings, they sat by the fire while Martha told stories of the old days, of Caleb as a boy, of the land before settlers came. Beatrice began to help around the ranch, finding satisfaction in work freely chosen. She baked bread in the mornings, tended to the vegetable garden, and even learned to help with the horses. For the first time in years, she slept without fear. But the specter of Frank loomed over her newfound peace. Each day she scanned the horizon, dreading the sight of a familiar silhouette. One evening, as she and Caleb walked back from the corral, their hands brushed. Without thinking, Beatrice entwined her fingers with his. Caleb stopped, looking down at their joined hands. "Beatrice," he said softly, "I don't want you to feel obligated in any way." She shook her head. "I don't." Standing on tiptoe, she pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek. "Thank you for showing me what kindness feels like." His eyes, so blue against his sun-darkened skin, searched hers. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he lowered his head. Their lips met in a kiss so tender it brought tears to her eyes. When they parted, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "I'm falling in love with you," he confessed. "But you're still married and you're still healing. I'll wait as long as you need." Beatrice touched his face, tracing the line of his jaw. "Some wounds heal faster with proper care," she whispered. The sound of hoofbeats shattered the moment. Caleb's head snapped up, his body tensing. "Get to the house," he ordered, his voice suddenly hard. "Tell Martha to bar the door." Beatrice ran, her heart pounding. Through the window, she watched as Frank Anderson rode into the yard, two rough-looking men flanking him. Even from a distance, she could see the rage contorting his features. "Sutton," Frank bellowed, dismounting. "I've come for my wife." Caleb stood his ground, one hand resting on the revolver at his hip. "Mrs. Anderson isn't going anywhere she doesn't want to go." Frank laughed, an ugly sound. "She's my property, same as my horse or my land. The law's on my side." "The law doesn't give you the right to beat a woman," Caleb replied, his voice steady. "Go home, Anderson. She's not coming back." Frank's face darkened. "I paid good money for those horses you've been breeding. Shame if something were to happen to them." He gestured to his companions. "Mason here is handy with a torch. Bradford can shoot the eyes out of a squirrel at 100 paces. "You're threatening me?" Caleb asked, his hand still on his gun. "Just stating facts," Frank replied. "Now, where is she?" Inside, Beatrice felt a cold determination replace her fear. She grabbed the rifle Caleb had taught her to shoot, checking that it was loaded. Martha tried to stop her, but Beatrice shook her head. "I need to end this," she said. "One way or another." She stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. "I'm right here, Frank." Frank's eyes narrowed as he took in the sight of his wife holding a weapon. "Put that down before you hurt yourself, Beatrice." "I know how to use it," she replied, leveling the rifle at him, "and I'm not going back with you, not today, not ever." Frank took a step toward her, his face twisted with rage. "You ungrateful, stay where you are," Caleb warned, drawing his revolver. One of Frank's companions, Mason, reached for his gun. Everything happened in a blur. Shots rang out. Beatrice screamed as Caleb fell backward, blood blooming on his shoulder. Frank lunged toward the porch. Beatrice fired the rifle. The kick slammed into her shoulder, but her aim was true. Frank stumbled, clutching his leg where the bullet had struck him. "You shot me," he said incredulously. "My own wife shot me." Bradford had his gun trained on Caleb, who was struggling to his feet, pressing his hand to his bleeding shoulder. "Drop your weapons," a new voice rang out. Sheriff Tyler Buchanan rode into the yard, flanked by 2 deputies. "What in God's name is going on here?" The next hours passed in a flurry of explanations and accusations. The sheriff, it seemed, had been tracking Frank and his companions, suspected of rustling cattle from neighboring ranches. When Frank mentioned looking for his runaway wife at Sutton's place, the sheriff had followed, arriving just in time. A doctor was summoned for Caleb, whose wound, though painful, wasn't life-threatening. Frank and his men were taken into custody. Frank for the rustling charges and for the assault on Caleb, his companions as accomplices. Before they left, Sheriff Buchanan approached Beatrice. "Mrs. Anderson, your husband claims you're his legal wife, and he has the right to take you home." Beatrice squared her shoulders. "Look at my face, Sheriff. Look at the bruises that haven't yet faded. Ask anyone in our old town about the screams they heard from our cabin. Is that what the law protects?" The sheriff studied her, his weathered face thoughtful. "The law is complicated when it comes to marriage, madam, but no, it doesn't protect a man's right to beat his wife." He glanced at Frank, who glared from the back of the wagon where he sat with his hands bound. "I can't promise what a judge might say, but I'll make sure your side of the story is heard." As they rode away, Beatrice felt a weight lift from her shoulders. It wasn't over. There would be a trial, testimony, legal complications, but for the first time she had hope. That night, after the doctor had treated Caleb's wound and left with instructions for care, Beatrice sat beside his bed. He was pale but alert, his eyes finding hers in the lamplight. "You were magnificent," he said softly. Standing up to him like that, she shook her head. "I was terrified." "Courage isn't the absence of fear," he replied. "It's acting in spite of it." Beatrice took his hand, careful of his injured shoulder. "I thought I might lose you." Caleb's fingers tightened around hers. "It'll take more than a bullet to keep me from you." 3 months later, Beatrice stood before Judge Wilson in the courthouse in Silvercliff. The courtroom was packed, the case having attracted attention throughout the county. Frank sat at one table, sullen and resentful, his leg still stiff from the gunshot wound. His trial for cattle rustling was scheduled for the following month, but today was about Beatrice's petition for divorce. "Mrs. Anderson," the judge said, peering at her over his spectacles, "you understand the gravity of what you're asking. Divorce is not granted lightly in this territory." "I do, Your Honor," Beatrice replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "My husband has beaten me regularly throughout our marriage. I feared for my life." The judge turned to Frank. "Mr. Anderson, these are serious allegations," Frank sneered. "A man has the right to discipline his wife. She was willful, disobedient." A murmur ran through the courtroom. The judge frowned. "Mr. Anderson, the law may grant you certain rights as a husband, but it does not grant you the right to brutalize your wife." Over the next hour, witnesses were called. To Beatrice's surprise, neighbors from near their old cabin testified to hearing her screams, seeing her bruises. The doctor from the nearest town confirmed treating her for suspicious injuries on multiple occasions. Martha spoke of Beatrice's condition when she arrived at the ranch. And finally, Caleb took the stand, describing what he had observed and Frank's threats. When all testimony was complete, the judge removed his spectacles, pinching the bridge of his nose. "In my 20 years on the bench, I have granted perhaps a dozen divorces. Each time, I have weighed carefully whether the sacred bonds of matrimony should be severed." He looked directly at Beatrice. "In this case, I find clear and compelling evidence that Mr. Anderson has violated the most basic duty of a husband to protect, not harm. The divorce is granted." Beatrice sagged with relief, tears springing to her eyes. From behind her, she heard Caleb's quiet exhalation. Frank leapt to his feet. "This is an outrage. She's my wife." "Not anymore," the judge said firmly. "And I would advise you, sir, to focus on your upcoming trial for cattle rustling. Sheriff, please remove Mr. Anderson." As Frank was led away, his face contorted with fury, he spat in Beatrice's direction. "This isn't over. Outside the courthouse, Caleb helped Beatrice into the wagon. The early autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and distant snow. Beatrice looked back at the building where her marriage had legally ended. "I'm free," she whispered. Caleb covered her hand with his. "Yes, you are." 6 months later, as spring painted the Colorado wilderness with wildflowers, Beatrice stood beneath an arbor of fresh-cut pine boughs. She wore a simple dress of pale blue silk, her golden hair adorned with mountain laurel. Before her stood Caleb, handsome in a new suit, his blue eyes shining with love. They had waited, giving Beatrice time to heal, to find herself again. Frank's trial for cattle rustling had ended with a lengthy prison sentence, removing the shadow of fear from her life. In the months since, she had blossomed, reclaiming the joyful spirit that Frank had nearly extinguished. "Do you, Caleb James Sutton, take Beatrice Elizabeth Anderson to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Pastor Miller asked. "I do," Caleb replied, his voice steady and sure. "And do you, Beatrice Elizabeth Anderson, take Caleb James Sutton to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Beatrice looked into the eyes of the man who had saved her, not just from Frank but from a life of fear and submission. The man who had taught her to ride and shoot, but more importantly, had taught her that she deserved gentleness and respect. "I do," she said, her heart full. As Pastor Miller pronounced them husband and wife, Caleb leaned down to whisper in her ear, "You own my heart completely, Mrs. Sutton." They celebrated their marriage with friends from near and far, Martha, of course, and Sheriff Buchanan, the neighbors who had testified on Beatrice's behalf, and many others who had supported them through the difficult times. As evening fell, Caleb led Beatrice away from the festivities to the small garden behind their home. In the months since her divorce, they had built a new house together, larger than Caleb's original cabin, with wide windows that let in light and a porch that wrapped around 3 sides. "I have something for you," Caleb said, taking a small package from his pocket. Beatrice unwrapped it to find a delicate silver key on a chain. "What does it open?" Caleb smiled. "Nothing, it's a symbol. You hold the key to your own life now. I never want to lock you in or hold you back. You're free to choose every day, and I hope you'll keep choosing me." Tears welled in Beatrice's eyes as she slipped the chain around her neck. "I will," she promised, "every day." 2 years later, Beatrice sat on the porch of their home, watching Caleb teach their 1-year-old daughter, Emma, to pet a gentle mare. The ranch had prospered, their breeding program for horses gaining reputation throughout the territory. Martha lived with them still, her health strong despite her advancing years. Beatrice's hand rested on her swelling belly where their second child grew. Looking at her husband and daughter, bathed in golden sunset light, she marveled at how completely her life had transformed. From terror to joy, from captivity to freedom, from surviving to thriving, as if sensing her thoughts, Caleb looked up, catching her eye. He smiled, that same warm smile that had given her hope on the darkest of days, the smile that still made her heart skip a beat. "I love you," he mouthed silently. "I love you too," she replied, certain that no matter what challenges the future might bring, they would face them together with strength and tenderness in equal measure. From the ashes of her first marriage, a phoenix had risen, a life built on mutual respect, shared dreams, and a love that healed rather than harmed. It was everything Beatrice had once thought impossible, now made real through courage, compassion, and the unwavering belief that everyone deserved to be loved completely, truly, and kindly. In the golden light of the Colorado sunset, Beatrice Sutton knew with absolute certainty that she was, at last, home.